Hello there, and welcome back to the Senate Podcast. I'm your host, Caleb Johnston, and today we have a really fun episode. We're doing a retrospective for Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. I'm joined by Tony, the Chosen One, Quinn. How do you like the Chosen One title?
It's a lot of weight to bear, I got a lot of people counting on me to bring balance or whatever, but
You have to bring balance to the podcast.
yeah. Well, I think I was born for such a time as this, so whatever.
This is what I'm going to take a blood sample and you're going to have midichlorians.
They're over 9,000.
If your midichlorians are high enough, then you can co-host. I think we're going to do a type of retrospective where we just look back at the Star Wars movies. I want to go in somewhat of an order. I would like to do the numbered ones first, all the episodes. So 1 through 9, starting with 1, ending with 9, and then we'll figure it out from there. But the Phantom Menace, there's a lot we could say about this one. But I want to start with the Phantom Menace because essentially George created one story, and that was episode 1 through 6. And the way he describes it is each episode is essentially a chapter within the story. And then he says each film fits into a larger mosaic, and we're dealing with micro stories in each episode. So I think, George started in the middle, and we can get into that, but I want to start with episode 1, and we can start from the beginning where everything is being set up, where everything's being introduced, and we can just go through the story in order within the world and story of the Star Wars universe. Do you like the way George did it with starting in the middle and doing 4, 5, and 6, then going back?
I mean, you would know this more than me, but I think I saw a quote from him that he said his idea for what he wanted the prequels to be weren't like the filmmaking technology of the time of making the originals wasn't up to par with how he wanted to represent that vision.
Exactly.
So I think it makes sense. It really speaks to the quality of the original trilogy, how it feels very gritty and rustic, it has that kind of feel to it. And because they were using a lot of practical effects, they were having some problems with certain things, which we'll talk about when we talk about those movies. But yeah, it lines up pretty well. And I see an artist making the best out of the resources that he had, and that's what a true artist is supposed to do.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. And one thing I do want to say is actually a quote from George. He talks about cyclical motifs. That's one thing that's going to be a reoccurring theme, which, that's the definition, is a cyclical motif. So he likes to start in the middle of the stories. That's what he did with episode 4. He started in the middle of the overall story of Star Wars that he had planned. Because like you said, he had episode 1 through 3 outlined from the very beginning, but the technology wasn't there. Each episode actually starts in the middle. So we talked a little bit about George and the overall idea he had for Star Wars. We're going to go through each episode. So let's just dive in to the Phantom Menace. It starts in the middle of an interaction between the Jedi and the Separatists. He likes to start in the middle of the stories. So he starts in this very first chapter into the story of Star Wars. And I'm just going based off what he thinks. Obviously we have more than just 6 Star Wars movies and whatnot, but this is the first chapter that he created. So I just want to get into the mind of George Lucas and what he was doing while he was filming and creating these movies, because I think that's going to help us to understand the movies even more, to analyze why George did what he did. So he starts in the middle of this interaction between the Jedi and the Separatists. So before I get into why he made the decisions with, Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan and the Neimoidians and the droids and whatnot, the whole blockade and that fun stuff, what do you think about the opening of the movie? From the crawl to starting with the Trade Federation and Separatists. That's a very exciting topic.
Well,
I know
I'm
you have
glad.
thoughts on it. I know
I
you have thoughts.
I'm glad you asked, Caleb, because some of my problems with the movie start with this opening crawl. So,
I knew it.
do you remember in A New Hope, the opening of that movie is Princess Leia sending a message to some guy named Obi-Wan, who we don't know yet, and he's
Yes.
crucial to, how this war is going to turn out. And if they don't reach him, basically it seems like he could help turn the tide. And, like we find out later, he was a Jedi, that's been in hiding. And it's like, oh, wow, the Jedi are these important heroes. They're involved in some big scale stuff. And then in this movie, I've written here, why are the Jedi here? Because we go from that to there's a dispute about the taxing of trade routes. So they send 2 Jedi to help solve a trade dispute involving taxes. And it's just like, what? Why are the Jedi here? There was something really funny about Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan just sitting at a table, drinking tea or whatever, just waiting for the new Gunray to show up so they could talk about taxes. I'm like, was this the best way to start this whole thing? I don't know. It's
Yeah,
it's it's strange.
it's strange, and I love it.
Of course.
So, a reoccurring theme or motif throughout probably all of these retrospectives is I'm gonna love everything George Lucas does. I just love George Lucas. I like how he does things, how he
I love him too.
thinks, how he tells stories, everything. I have a lot of quotes from him. I'm gonna drop some knowledge, okay? I always found this time period extremely interesting because it's not the Empire and it's not the Clone War era where Jedi have more power, essentially. This is pre-Clone Wars, which I always found pre-Clone Wars very interesting because this isn't the Old Republic. It's not the High Republic. This is a weird time. This is one of the only, I think, really one of the only pieces of Star Wars media out there that's during this time. Of course, you have Master and Apprentice and Dooku Jedi Lost and Plagueis, some books around this time period, and there's some cool things going on. But essentially, everything going on from the start of this movie, from right before the start of this movie to the start of this movie, is involving Anakin's fall. So I love this time period for one. When the movie opens up, you get the Jedi and whoever's on their ship. They're transmitting to the Separatists, and Newt Gunray says, "Well, it's legal for us to blockade right here." So you immediately jump into a taxation, this blockade going on for taxes and stuff with Naboo in that system. Very boring. It's a boring movie. This is probably the least exciting Star Wars movie, and it has some of the best action in it, but it's very boring.
Yeah.
And I think, I know you have something to add to that, but you brought up Qui-Gon. I find Qui-Gon extremely interesting, and I just went back and rewatched the first scene because Qui-Gon, he kind of follows aside the Jedi. He's not wanted in the Council, but they want him as a Jedi. People call him a gray Jedi. I don't see that as a thing. I don't see a gray Jedi as a thing. He just has a different set of beliefs than the Jedi, and that will come up as a very important thing later on in the story when Anakin gets involved. But when they start out, Obi-Wan says, "I sense something, in the Force," and Qui-Gon says, "I don't sense anything." And what's funny is Obi-Wan isn't known for his Force abilities. He actually has a very low midichlorian count. He's just a very skilled duelist, and obviously he's just very capable. But he's not known for his Force abilities, so it's funny that Obi-Wan can sense something that Qui-Gon can't, and I was wondering why that was the case. So Obi-Wan says, "It's not here. I sense something else out there that's going wrong." Who knows what that could have been? I don't know. But Qui-Gon says, "Focus on here and now. Obi-Wan brings up the teaching of Yoda, which is something that we were talking about before we started the podcast. In the original trilogy, Obi-Wan says that Yoda was his master and what he was trained by Yoda, correct?
Yeah.
George Lucas brings up in the commentary for this movie, specifically talking about Anakin, how when they bring in Force-sensitive younglings at a very young age, probably 3 or 4, as young as they can, bring them in, Yoda trains them until they're about the age of 7 or 8, and then they're given to a Jedi Knight as a Padawan. So technically, that was right, that Master Yoda did train Obi-Wan. In the opening of The Phantom Menace, he even says that. He says, Yoda trained me to do this. But what Qui-Gon's response is, he says, pay attention to the living force. That was his response to him. And I think this is a big distinction between how Qui-Gon thinks and believes compared to the, probably overwhelming majority of Jedi. He says, pay attention to the living force. And Yoda always told Obi-Wan you want to be mindful of the future. So Obi-Wan is trying to be mindful of the future. And I'm going somewhere with this. Qui-Gon says, not at the expense of the present. Think about the way that Yoda trained and kind of mentored and taught Anakin. He told him to think about the future. And Anakin had that specific ability to where he could sense things that were going to happen. So what happens when you take somebody that is so has such a high midichlorian count and is so capable as Anakin, and you give him the teachings of Yoda and not Qui-Gon? That's the distinction between Qui-Gon and the other Jedi, specifically Yoda. And you can see it within Obi-Wan in the first opening 3 minutes of the movie. You get to see how wise Qui-Gon is and how he influences Obi-Wan to kind of become that Alec Guinness Obi-Wan that we see in the original trilogy, where he's a little bit more wise. He's not as, run in and handle things as he is in the Phantom Menace, because he's still a Padawan at this point. So I actually love the interaction between Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan throughout this entire movie. I think it's one of the best relationships and dynamics and duos in the entire Star Wars franchise. Qui-Gon is a beloved Jedi. Everybody loves Qui-Gon. So I just love seeing them at the beginning of the movie, even though they're dealing with taxation and Nute Gunray and the Nemoidians. It's interesting to me.
I just thought an interesting parallel with because like a famous thing that George has said that's kind of become like a meme is certain things in Star Wars rhyme.
It's like poetry.
Like the whole saga is essentially like a giant poem, and like every stanza rhymes with the next one stuff. In this scene, Obi-Wan's sensing something bad in the future, and Qui-Gon's telling him to be mindful of the present.
Yes.
In Empire, Luke is sensing things in the future involving Han and Leia, and Yoda's telling him to focus on the here and now. And then in Last Jedi, he gives Luke that lesson again. I never put that together till now that's like a nice thing that like pops up. Yeah,
a lesson that Yoda learned because of Anakin.
Yeah.
And we get to see that. We get to see this whole thing start in the Phantom Menace. And I think that's one of the reasons Phantom Menace is a boring movie. It is the setup and introduction of the characters we meet throughout the rest of the movies. So George has to take the time and actually take a lot of exposition to establish these characters. And it's fun what he does with the exposition, because that's why we get secondary characters in this movie like Jar Jar, the Gungans, the droids, even the way Anakin is portrayed in this movie as a secondary character. All right. Anything else you got to say about the fun taxation and blockades in the first part of this movie?
In a way, it kind of feels like a Quentin Tarantino movie. In terms of like, like you have all these people in one location and then like rising stakes. And then, there's like a big climax where like everything just, hits the fan and unfolds. So I actually like the structuring of it. I mean, I still think it's kind of a little too
bland.
boring and dull. But this is probably the movie in the prequels that feels the closest to the original trilogy in some ways, in terms of like
I would
how
agree
it
with that.
looks and
Yeah.
like how it, feels in certain ways.
So I'll say something about that real quick. George had a lot of ideas, specifically for episode 4 that he wanted to use, but he couldn't. And that has a lot to do with the set design and even some of the locations they film that he couldn't use for episode 4. So he actually implemented them in this episode. So I would agree with you. Phantom Menace feels the most like the original trilogy because I think he used the Phantom Menace to capitalize on a lot of things he missed out on in the original trilogy. And for example, one is Coruscant, which we'll get to. But I got 2 more things to say about kind of this first part. This was actually the first time that the entire set was filmed on blue screen. They did not have any kind of on location site for this bridge scene.
Really?
Yes, it was all blue screen.
I thought it
So
looked like it didn't look as obvious to me as some moments in the other movies. Like I thought they were using a set like they did in A New Hope when they're on the ship in the opening. I thought it was
yeah,
something like that. I didn't know that was also blue screen. Wow.
yep. The opening scenes were the first time they filmed with absolutely no set. So that's going to obviously be a theme where now VFX and technology, ILM and George are going to use it a lot. The story you actually brought up in the Last of Us analysis review that we had, the difference between the main character and the protagonist, and I thought that was really interesting. So can you explain that?
Yeah, so like in stories, sometimes like a lot of stories, like the main character is also the protagonist because they're like at the
Yes.
center of everything. But in some stories, the main character is sometimes called principal character, and the protagonist are both two central characters, but the protagonist drives the plot forward while the main character is impacted by the plot. So like in
Yes.
an example that I found when I was working on a YouTube video is Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Willy Wonka is the protagonist because he
Yes.
organizes the whole lottery contest for the tickets and everything, and like he makes things happen in that movie. But Charlie Bucket is the main character because he's the most impacted and he's who we follow.
So one thing I love about George and what he does in this movie specifically, the Jedi are the protagonists. We see everything through their point of view, and that's how we open up the movie, is with the point of view of Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan. But the main character is actually Padme. The
You
war on
think?
Naboo is the central story of this episode. So I always found that interesting because,
Main character is Padme. I never.
yes.
Huh. I guess that kind of makes sense now that I think about it.
Now, of course, there's a ton of stuff going on in this movie. They're setting up a lot of different things. I love the way that it's told through the Jedi's point of view, and Anakin isn't even the main character. The main character is actually Padme and what's going on with the war on Naboo. Listen, I got the receipts, man. I transcripted the whole commentary from George Lucas. This sequence ends with the Jedi trying to reach the Queen before the Separatists do, and this drives the plot along. And of course, we run into Jar Jar. Once they reach down, they land on Naboo. We get to see the flora, the fauna. He establishes new environments. He got to film on location in Italy for Naboo. And that's one thing George does in every Star Wars movie. He creates new environments, whether it's on location shooting or with miniatures or VFX. That's something that he really revolutionized with these movies was the locations and just the scope. We get introduced to new species, Jar Jar, for example. We actually get introduced to the droids. And the droids were designed and created to be goofy, to be bad shots, to have no defense. And as we go on throughout the saga, the technology and the advancements of who the Jedi or the main character are, who they're fighting, gets better and better. So this is actually the lowest point for the opposition of the Jedi. Because think about it. They start out the movie fighting the droids who really they have no problems with. The only problems they have are the destroyers. They don't really run into a problem until they meet the Sith. So that's a cool thing he establishes here is, usually we see the hero as being weaker and the villain as being stronger, and that's how it was in the original trilogy. Now flip that, you got the Jedi being invincible and the droids and separatists being the ones that are scared of the Jedi, and that's just a cool visual you get to see that they establish in the first third of the movie. Like I said, they start in the middle of a story, and it's this blockade that's happening. We don't know how it started on Naboo. All we know is that the Jedi showed up. We're seeing it through their eyes. So they go to meet the Queen. They find her, right, and help me out here. They find her. They get in her ship, which is the silver ship, the Naboo one. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
And they leave the planet. This is where we're introduced to one of the most important characters in all of Star Wars. This is where they introduce R2-D2. I have a lot to say about him and all of this, but what do you think so far? Meeting the Gungans, going to the Capitol, being introduced to R2. This is all in the first third of the movie. So,
I
what do you think
hear
about the Gungans?
some people, I've heard it pronounced Gungans, but then they themselves say Gungans.
Gungans.
So which one is it? Like, is there like a established?
I say Gungan, but
I like their city. Like, I like it. Like it looks cool. Underwater city of these, like, I guess what they're like, frogs, right? Like
amphibian, whatever.
anthropomorph amphibious creatures. Boss Nass is a lot of fun.
He's cool.
He's a memorable, fun character. I mean, I know it's a cliche for anyone saying anything negative about the prequels, but I don't like Jar Jar. I like he's probably like one of the few characters. Here's a spicy take number one. He's one of the few characters in this movie that actually has an established personality. Boom, there it is.
Okay.
But like I think George went overboard on him. Like, he's too ridiculous. He's too, like, he's annoying. Like, I get, like, like Return of the Jedi had the Ewoks. This movie has Jar Jar. I get it. You want to appeal to kids, but like, he's almost too much of a caricature in that respect. And it really sucks that people bullied Ahmed Best so much that he actually considered suicide at one point because of the backlash to him in this movie, and like, he's not the problem with this movie. Like, he did what he had to do, and he's a great performer. You could tell he's a great performer. He brought so much life to Jar Jar. I just don't like the writing of the character, but it's nothing to do with him in any way. It's just been always one of those things. Like, whenever I watch this movie and we meet Jar Jar, I'm like, here we go. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
It's over the top. It's a lot to sit through.
And I hate the way he speaks. Why does he speak in Pig Latin? Oh my god.
He's over the top. I agree with you. So the Gungan city's cool. I agree. I like the way he has that set up, and they serve a purpose, which I like the way that the people and just the Gungans are wrote into the story because they serve a purpose.
I'll say this. Here's a little preview for our Return of the Jedi episode. The Gungans are incorporated into the resolution of Phantom Menace way better than the freaking Ewoks incorporated into that movie.
I agree. I think Jar Jar was a little over the top, but the Gungans, like you said, they're good. They're good. So I think we should establish that we like the Gungans.
I would hang out with them if they invited me. I get to be underwater. I freaking love water. Are you kidding me? I get to fly in a bongo.
I have more to say about them later. So they get to Theed, which is the capital. They get the Queen and they leave. And we're introduced to R2. What do you think about R2?
I mean, he's always been one of the best characters. Like, it's so crazy. Like, it's a testament to, I guess, I mean, mainly George, but like also like the like the people creating the practical effects for Jar Jar and how he's framed and everything. But he's a droid. But
Yeah.
throughout all the movies, he has a lot of personality.
Yes. Yeah.
Like he's like sassy, him and C-3PO banter all the time. Like it's so crazy. Like he he screams like a human, which is funny, and I love that they never explain why that is. I just
It's
love
just
that.
a
Like
thing.
it's just a really fun thing. I do find it weird that like because in the original trilogy when Luke meets C-3PO and R2, when C-3PO introduces R2, Luke like he's like sarcastically like hello, like like he's like I gotta introduce myself to this droid. That's stupid. Like a droid's just a tool. But then in this movie, R2's seen as like a hero because he helps repair the ship, and then Queen Amidala is like, "Oh, clean off this droid. Where we owe it our gratitude." And it's like, okay, like people respect droids. That's interesting. I mean, it's not necessarily bad, but it's just like
Yeah.
it's I think like, and like it's like a small detail that's never explained really. It's just like like why does Queen Amidala have such a high opinion of droids? I don't know, but it's fun.
Yeah, and it's just a way to introduce R2, and he's always been a hero throughout the entire series. Every movie he's in, he's seen
Oh yeah,
as a hero. So his introduction in this movie is no different at all. It establishes him as a hero figure. So that's one character that's he establishes. So the ship gets damaged, and they have to make an emergency landing on a planet called Tatooine. And one thing I thought was very interesting about the Phantom Menace compared to A New Hope is they land in Mos Espa. They don't land in Mos Eisley. So right there, you get a sense of just how big this world is.
I
They land,
never, I didn't know that that was a separate place. Actually, I
yes,
just assumed because like it's just like framed and everything like in a
yeah,
New Hope when they get to Mos Eisley. So I was just like, oh, it's probably essentially that, just back then. But
and
I
was
didn't know
just
that
a
was a different place. That's cool.
yeah. And another cool fact about that is the reason it's a different place is because George didn't have the tech to make Mos Eisley look like how he wanted. So Mos Espa is actually originally how he envisioned Mos Eisley to look.
Oh,
Very interesting.
well, that makes sense with what he did in the special editions. Of
Yeah,
the original trilogy. Yeah, I mean,
with
as much as I
Jabba.
have problems with a lot of those changes, it now that you bring that up, it makes sense why he, changed how it looked and made it look like where they are in Phantom Menace. It's because it was supposed to be that.
I knew I would change your mind.
Not exactly, but I see what he was doing
Yeah,
now.
yeah. There's the Phantom Menace. It is underappreciated. I'm not gonna say it's underrated or overrated. I think it's underrated, but I could see how it's probably someone's least favorite.
I still have
It's
a
not.
soft spot for it at the end of the day.
Yeah, I have so much nostalgia for this movie, and I guess I could talk about that real quick. I mean, I was pretty much born when this came out, and I grew
Okay.
up with it. And you see a lot of merchandise from episode one. You don't even see as much merchandise from episode two, or I would even argue episode three. I don't know why, but I always see
I
merchandise
mean,
for episode one.
I was a kid. I was like 12 when Revenge of the Sith came out, and I saw plenty of merchandise. But I mean, to be
Yeah,
fair, I, I'm pretty. I did see Phantom Menace when I was a kid at some point. I don't know how long it had been out, but I didn't remember. There were like a few scenes that I remembered, so I don't know. I didn't like pay attention to like the action figures and stuff, but I
I
remember
had every
seeing
toy.
some things. Oh wow.
I had Watto. I had Sebulba. Had everybody.
I had a
Loved it.
lunchbox with
Oh,
Anakin. I think it was
yes.
Anakin riding a speeder
Yes. Yes.
when in elementary school.
Yeah, and
That
that's
was
what I'm
cool.
saying. This movie, I think a lot of people have a lot of nostalgia for it because of how it was, you know, so big in pop culture like that with merchandise and everything else. The movie was huge. So they land in Mos Espa. I mentioned Watto. We meet Watto, and he introduces us to Anakin. How do you make a backstory for the most infamous villain in the history of cinema? You know what I mean? That's a big task.
Yeah.
You expect, Vader. You don't know who Anakin is. The only glimpse of Anakin you get is at the end of Return of the Jedi. But you have no idea what led, you know, whoever Anakin was to become Vader at this point. So, what are you expecting the backstory of Vader to be? You might not be expecting him to be how George envisioned him, and George, wanted him to be earnest, to be honest, to be good nature, and to be the opposite of everything that Vader was, so that he could raise the question after you watch the Phantom Menace: what could possibly happen for him to become Vader at this point? I know we have some problems with the acting for Anakin in this.
I don't. I have
I
problems
have
with the writing, not the acting.
I have problems with. Okay, so we differ on that. I don't have problems with the writing at all. I have problems with the acting. Not saying he was bad, but
Yeah.
there is a documentary on YouTube. I forget what the
Yeah.
title is. You saw it.
Yeah,
I think I
that
shared it with you.
one kid that even looks like Mark Hamill, dude. I'm like,
I
yo, what the
He would have been
hell?
perfect. I didn't like Jake Lloyd that much. Even growing up, I was like, whatever.
I
I
mean,
liked him
yeah,
better in Jingle All the Way, personally. But what's your talk to me about Anakin,
okay,
the
where
issues you got.
did you want me to start with my praise, my quote unquote praise of the performance, or my problem with the writing?
Well, what do you think about the introduction and the writing around his introduction, and then just tell me about how you feel about the character, the writing overall.
Okay, so we see Anakin. He's Watto's slave,
Yes, that's a
essentially. Like
big aspect. What do you
he
think about that?
he has him working, in his shop. I mean, I mean, in A New Hope, Obi-Wan says that Anakin was the best star pilot in the galaxy, and so like it makes sense that he would be somebody who was a technician, a mechanic. Like he would work with various kind of machines, and I I really like the scene where he's talking to Padme for the first time. Just I actually unironically love that scene, but when she says like you really know a lot or something or no she's like how do you know so much
Yes,
and then he's like oh I hear people talk like the pilots and stuff talk. I was like
that's
yeah, Anakin
that's
would have
awesome.
been a
Yeah,
kid who listened to like pilots talk about stuff and like learn things like on the street, just like being in certain environments. So I think that's a great detail, and I actually really like that.
actually, let's just stay on his introduction before we get into his overall character, because there's a lot going on in this Mos Espa, portion of the movie. Pretty much the whole second act of the movie. So we'll definitely get back to Anakin, but we're introduced to somebody else, and that person is C-3PO.
I hate this. I'm just gonna say I hate this. I yeah.
So Vader isn't only Luke and Leia's father, but now he's 3PO's, and that was the point of making 3PO being created by Anakin in this.
Terrible.
What's your issue with it?
Because it's like
I'm indifferent.
it's so contrived. Like I don't know why. See, this is my biggest problem with the prequels is that in the original trilogy, Anakin was just a guy who was part of this larger story and just had a tragic backstory. He knew Obi-Wan, so he had a connection to Obi-Wan. You know, he was his friend. He fell to the dark side, you know. But then George took that and was like, hey, what if he was literal Jesus if Jesus fell to the dark side? Like, he made him so central to the entire story. And he has to do this thing throughout all the movies where he's like, hey, do you remember this thing from the original trilogy that had a really mundane
Yeah.
origin or no origin at all? What if it was really important? And I don't understand why he did that. And also, why would Anakin make an etiquette and protocol droid to help his mom around the house?
Yes.
Instead, he should have created a droid like R2D2, or maybe just have him create R2D2. Why
So fun
not? I
fact,
mean, if you're going to have him make a droid, have him make the droid who makes sense.
he debated, and he, as in George, debated on who should be the droid that Anakin created, R2 or 3PO, and pretty much the only reason it was 3PO is because he liked R2D2 more, so he wanted him to get the hero moment, like he had in the original trilogy.
I mean,
so he just pretty much
sure.
left 3PO, with Anakin. I'm indifferent, but I get what you mean.
I mean, it's just such a weird thing. Like,
Yeah,
oh,
I agree.
like he, he was working on a droid. Oh, and it's this character, It's like, I just wish there were more things in the prequels that didn't give like some grand reveal to just a thing that we saw before. Or
His
a
design,
character.
I loved his design though.
Yeah,
No shell,
it was a pretty good practical, practical effect too.
all the wires. Ani. Sorry, Watto is amazing, and
I
you
like
brought
Watto.
up, you brought up a crucial,
He's a fun
aspect
character.
of his character in this, which is he's a slave. Him and his mother. The Jedi come, and what happens? He meets Qui-Gon, and he sees Qui-Gon's lightsaber. He's heard stories of the Jedi. He wants the Jedi to save him and his mother.
Dude, I love that line where he's like, I had a dream that I was a Jedi and I came here and freed all
It's
the
so good.
slaves. And it's like, when you look at what the trajectory of his story is,
Yes.
that's kind of what he was trying to do, is free all the slaves.
See, and
the
that's
slaves, quote unquote.
Yes, and
slaves to the
we agree.
Republic. The slaves to the Republic, not like all, like not just like literal slaves, but people who were slaves to, a system or an ideology.
I'm gonna hit
And
you
then
with this.
his redemption is him not being a slave. He was born a slave, basically, but he didn't die a slave.
But even when he left Tatooine, he was still a slave. Slave to the Jedi, slave to the dark side. Until his son. So, he was a slave. He saw Qui-Gon's lightsaber. He knew about the Jedi. He wanted the Jedi to save him and his mother. So, there's this plot device where they were stuck. Their ship broke down. They needed parts. So, what they were going to do is they were going to have this kid who they could sense there was something different about him. So, what they do is there's a sandstorm, whatever. They get trapped there, and there's this really long scene of them just eating dinner and talking. So we agree that the dialogue in the Star Wars movies, it's not the best.
In the prequel, well, in the original trilogy, it's realistic but cheesy. In the prequels, everybody feels like a AI program, and it's really weird.
Yeah, so George doesn't like to explain things, to tell. He likes to show. So this is one of the only scenes in the movie where you have this exposition that really does explain some critical things to the story. And what George calls this specific scene right here is the pointer scene. And it is an explanation of what needs to happen. And these scenes are either really boring or really hard to pull off. But they're absolutely essential in telling the story. And they usually come about this point, in the movie. This is where we get the introduction of midichlorians.
Wait, are we going to talk about Jake? We can talk about Jake. I just feel like that.
We'll get there.
Okay.
I want to explain a little bit more about Anakin's character in this, because we haven't talked
Oh, yeah.
about the inclusion of
I'm
midichlorians.
curious to see what you think about this because I kind of don't have a set opinion
Okay.
necessarily.
So, do you want me to just keep going? I was gonna hand it over to you.
Oh yeah, so Anakin and Qui-Gon are talking, and he takes some of his blood. I don't remember like what excuse he gave, but if some dude that I just met wanted to take some of my blood, I'd probably kill him, to be honest.
I think,
Um,
yeah, I think it was just from, like you said, the conversation he had with Padme and all of his knowledge, and saying that he was a pod racer and
yeah.
that he is the best. You know, they could sense something was different about him. So,
But yeah, he radios Obi-Wan, who's on the ship, which I think is one of the biggest problems of the movie is Obi-Wan stuck on the damn ship for a long time, but that's another tangent. And then he's like, "Hey, I'm sending you a blood sample. Can you analyze it?" And then Obi-Wan's like, "Wow, his metachlorian counts are really high, even more than Master Yoda." And then Qui-Gon's just like shocked by that. And then Anakin asks him what midichlorians are, and then he's like, "Yeah, basically midichlorians are these microscopic organisms that live in your blood or whatever, and they can hear the Force talk to them directly, and then they're essentially like a bridge between the Force and people." And a lot of fans hated this because in the original trilogy, the Force was just like, this purely spiritual thing. Like if you believe in it, you could tap into it and that's it. And now it's like this like weird science stuff. But ultimately, I think I like it more than I don't because it reminds me of like, other religions. For example, like Christianity. Like there are some, sects of Christianity that have like a really fundamental literal view of like certain biblical things and certain spiritual things. And then, like they're like ultra spiritual about stuff like, like they don't really trust like the like medicine or, doctors or anything because they're like, oh, I can, like my faith is more than enough to, find healing and all that. And then there are some sects of Christianity that are more practical minded, like they're very, like they don't think that the earth is like just thousands of years old. They believe in things like evolution and things like that, but they still have, a spiritual belief in, God and Jesus or whatever. So I interpret this as like maybe Qui-Gon, like maybe like certain Jedis have a view of the Force that involves metachlorians, but maybe Obi-Wan and Yoda never like quite bought into it, and then that's why they teach it as more of like a pure spiritual thing. So like
okay,
it was one of those things that like really made me wonder more things about the universe.
interesting. You're making me dive deep here off the top of my head, but George Lucas has obviously a lot of influences from the Buddhist religion as well as the Christian religion. He was practicing Buddhism at the time, and I believe his wife at the time was practicing, well, she was Pentecostal, I believe.
I think I might have heard that. I don't
So
remember.
that's where you get all the spiritual aspects from this from. Now, what you're saying about midichlorians, I believe it's revisionist history that the Force in the original trilogy was all spiritual. It was, but it actually wasn't. I'm gonna
I
give
mean, there
you
was that
some.
line where, sorry to cut you off, but like there's
Okay.
a like Luke says when he's talking to Leia in Return of the Jedi, he says the Force is strong in my family, which I don't think you could interpret that in a pure spiritual sense because then that'd be like, yeah, my family lineage just happened to, be really strong believers in this metaphysical thing. Like that doesn't, I mean, that makes sense, because like some Christians come from a long line of Christians, but you can also interpret it as he's like talking about it's literally strong in my family, like in a scientific sense.
See, that's what he was saying. That's what I'm saying. I think it's revisionist history going back and saying that it's all spiritual. Here's Here's what I'm going to give you. I'm going to give you quotes directly from George Lucas. Ready? The midichlorians existed from the beginning, so before episode 4. Like we stated, the outlines for the prequels were done from the beginning. George started on episode 4 because of, one, lack of technology to show the Clone Wars, etc., and he likes to start in the middle of the story anyways. All right, so midichlorians, they're meant to be cryptic, but their job is to be a physiological device used, and then here's going to be my quotes. I'm paraphrasing George Lucas. They're used to be sensitive to the Force. Why some people are more susceptible to the Force than others, which is an issue from the first film. Some people have it strong, then it's not as strong with other people. What is the device that causes that to happen? The idea of a symbiotic relationship, which is a theme in the whole movie, people helping people, that there might be a completely different race of life form that lives inside your body, completely independent of you, that has some influence over you. End
I
quote.
kind of think that it still has a excuse me, has a strong spiritual undertone even with the midichlorians, because it just made me think of like, because like if you're like, there's like what they call new age spiritualism, that it's more about like, like God isn't like up in the sky somewhere outside of you, like like we're all created in the image of God, so God lives within every one of us. We just have to learn how to like tap into ourselves and get in touch with that part of ourselves. So you could look, because like Luke, now we know because of this movie, he was had a high metachlorian count, but he still fails time and time again. Why? Because he wasn't totally in tune with himself. So if you have the capacity to be strong with the Force, but you're not in tune with yourself, then you can't really tap into the midichlorians. So it's like, it still really doesn't matter. You know what I mean? Whereas if you have a small count of midichlorians, but you're in tune with yourself, you be strong with the Force, because it's not just about that. It's also about your, your state of mind and stuff.
So remember that, because I'm going to bring that up during Duel of the Fates when we talk about it at the end. This is the distinction between Qui-Gon and the Jedi. You're thinking in terms of the Jedi Council, because what does tapping into the midichlorians even mean? Did Luke fail because he wasn't tapping in to the midichlorians, or was he tapped into the midichlorians, therefore he was supposed to fail? We'll get to it. So it's interesting. So that was what George had to say about the midichlorians. I like the midichlorians. I like how much they just don't bring it up, though. It's okay, it's a thing, but it doesn't matter. Like, nowhere in the movies do they talk about Obi-Wan's midichlorian count.
Yeah,
and I think that's fine.
They could have had that like really stupid like chosen one fate thing where it's like, like, oh yes, I beat you because my midichlorian. Like, they bring it up once in this movie and then never again. So it's like, like, it doesn't affect the other movies that much. What do you think about it?
So growing up, even when I, like I said, even when I was little watching this, I always attributed midichlorians to almost this bygone era within Star Wars, because of Episode 1 taking place in the time it does before the Clone Wars. The culture of the Jedi, it just seemed like they were behind the times. Like, they got extremely caught off guard when the Sith came back, or when the droid army got revealed to them at the beginning of the movie. They didn't have a clone army ready. The clone army was created actually by Palpatine. So what I'm saying is, like, they're following this type of, aspect, or, of the Force, which is midichlorians, that is kind of from an era where it doesn't have that much significance in reality. What was more important was the prophecy. It wasn't the physiological aspect of the individual. It was more so the prophecy of, Anakin, you're the chosen one, which I think we have a good understanding of what that means. And we're going to have the chosen one discussion in another episode. But
Yeah,
I
because
agree
I
with you.
mean, George talked about his plan for later movies, and he said that uh, it would be revealed that Leia would be the chosen one. So that right there kind of makes me wonder either George has kind of lost his mind, or the chosen one is purely based on circumstance, and it's not like a set binary thing. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I kind of like the idea with Ray. Like, we could talk about this when we get to those movies, but I kind of like the idea that the Force chooses whoever it has to in whatever time, you know. So it's like, okay,
Yeah.
this person was the chosen one, but they failed. So now we're gonna pick. Let's see. I'm gonna choose that person now.
I think that's the only logical explanation for it, and that's logical because I think that's what George was going to do,
Yeah,
but we never got it. I like the idea of this being a finite story. I like that it starts with 1, ends with 6, and there's only one chosen one in the history, of time, and we are watching the most seminal moment in the course of, you know, the history. You know what I mean? I like that this is that significant, and
wait, were Luke and Leia technically twins?
yes,
Well, then what if, because, like twins are kind of one person in a way, like, like
I
they're
see I
one
know what you mean. I
egg
know
that,
what you mean.
so
Yeah,
what if, like,
I
you
think
know,
that's the explanation for why Leia, really
wait,
is.
no, I'm thinking, because Leia's his so I wonder if, like, being the child of the chosen one, but then Luke wasn't the chosen one, so then why? It's weird that he would be like, oh yeah, Leia was the chosen one. Like,
Luke was the
Anakin
catalyst.
was the chosen one. What are you talking about?
So
How's Leia now? Like,
I can't wait to talk about episode 3 and 6 specifically, especially 6. Return of the Jedi is one of my favorite movies ever. Um, Luke was the catalyst for his father to turn not back to the light, but to bring balance to the Force.
yeah,
So, um, but yes, Luke and Leia are twins. Leia was Force sensitive. She could sense Luke at the end of Empire.
yeah,
All of that. So you're onto something there. So moving on from this midichlorian section, we talked about how they're stranded in Mos Espa. They need parts for their ship to fix it. How they're going to do that is the pod race. They're going to have Anakin win it, and Qui-Gon's going to bet on him. And when they win, they're going to get the parts and be back into their journey. So
I love that. Like, we talk about Qui-Gon's, like, gray-ish moral compass. Like,
yes,
he's not necessarily like a straight-laced hero. Like, he does what he has to do. I mean, and when Watto rolls the dice, Qui-Gon subtly manipulates it to get the outcome that he wants. And, like, I just that right there makes me wonder. Like, I wonder if, like, imagine him, like, when he was younger and, like, he was in battle and stuff training. Like, I wonder if he got to where he is partially because he was willing to cheat, you know what I mean? But in his eyes, it was justified. Like, that makes me wonder a whole lot about Qui-Gon that I think's really cool, personally.
I agree. I can't think of anything off the top of my head from the EU, but that Qui-Gon, he's one of my favorites ever. I mean, everybody loves Qui-Gon, and it's because of that mystery to him, but also that I'm not just gonna follow the dogmatic views. I'm gonna follow
Yeah.
the living force, which is something that he would have taught Anakin. But
I
we'll get
think
to that.
Qui-Gon was a pioneer in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. Like, for, like, I think, like, if he wouldn't have died, he probably would have started, like, a
Ooh,
new movement of Jedi, kind of. Maybe, like, a little rebellious. Like, in a
we're gonna
way,
get to that.
Qui-Gon's like Jesus. Like, he shows up, and, all the, like, straight-laced religious people don't really like him that much. And he's like, I'm gonna do my thing, man. What are you gonna do? Like, you know.
So we'll get to that at the end because he the thread of that gray area, not gray Jedi, but the gray area within the Jedi Order. It's not only with Qui-Gon, it's with somebody else too that we see in the next movie. So, like you said, he manipulates the dice. So he manipulates the dice, but we got to talk about the pod race. We got to talk about pod racing. What do you think about pod racing? Isn't it it better be the coolest thing you've ever seen in your life, or you're getting kicked out the call?
No, the idea. I think pod racing sucks. No, no, I think pod racing as a concept is really cool. You know, really fun. I mean, they made plenty of spin-off pod racing games because
Star Wars
pod
Racer.
racing's cool. Yeah. There was one in the arcade that I was always bad at because like the steering's a little weird. But the pod racing sequence in this movie, it's not bad, but it's a lot of like every shot like pans from left to right. You know, like it's kind of presented in this. It's not necessarily boring, but it also I feel like it should be like. Have you ever seen Speed Racer, the
Yes.
movie? Yeah, I kind of wish that the pod racing scene had the energy of the races in that movie a little bit. Um, but I mean, it's cool. Like the sand people show up and like start like trying to snipe people, and it's like, why would they do that? Well, because they're assholes and they just like to start trouble. You know, like it's like it's kind of this like
And Saboba.
yes, Sabalba's. I have a thought about that includes him a little bit when we get to Anakin's character, but yeah, it's like this like like grungy thing that people place bets on. Like it's cool. Like it's basically the Star Wars equivalent of like underground racing.
And that's what George was going for. So the pod racing set was all miniatures, because you can't have something this scale without either going extremely big or extremely small. So they chose to have a miniature set, and then everything was CGI, VFX. George said something like this would have been impossible in the original trilogy.
Yeah.
So again, ILM, Industrial Light and Magic, absolutely revolutionized VFX and CGI and filmmaking, which obviously led to the current day where movies are all green. But this was a portion of the movie that they used heavy VFX in, and it took 9 months to film this section.
Wow, I can imagine.
The original cut of this section was 40 minutes long.
Wow.
So they, of course, for pacing purposes, shortened it. And this is what George says about this specific section is it's the ultimate kid version of racing cars, just because of the craziness of it, the chaotic nature of it, but also, it's just a fun action sequence with awesome visuals. George loves speed. He loves racing cars. He wanted to make this reminiscent of his first movie, THX. And this is also, in terms of the context of the story. We heard about Anakin having a high midichlorian count, but this is the first time we get a visual of why Anakin's special. And it's seen through the eyes of Qui-Gon. And he sees specifically Anakin's agility, his speed, all of his skills, and then also he can see things before they happen. So not only was this just an awesome sequence, and one thing I'll point out about it is the sound effects.
Yeah.
Absolutely amazing. There was no music until the very end. It was like quiet, and it just sounded like, insane cars. You know what I mean? Like engines, and George loved that stuff. And I think the sound mixing and everything here, amazing. Especially for its time, amazing. Thoughts on that? Because that's all I got to say about the pod racing.
I mean, yeah, like, it is pretty, like a groundbreaking scene for sure. Like the pod racing helmet that Anakin has is like one of the most iconic, things in a Star Wars movie. I mean, His speeder looks cool. One thing that I really love is that it's consistent throughout all the Star Wars movies. The look of the aliens is always on point.
I
and
agree.
like
I
and like
I agree.
it's like really cool. Like it would have been easy just to have the other people in this race be like species that we've basically seen before, but they created
Yeah,
brand new species that we've never seen just for this one section where they all, I guess, they die, right? I mean, when they wipe out, it's not very pretty.
pretty much. Yeah,
Yeah, so like just for them to get smoked, but like you see them, like you know it's it's like a really cool, like it's a really like
it's a lot of
say
effort
what
for
you
a moment
will,
that really doesn't matter.
as say what you will about these movies. I have my problems with them, but you can't say that George didn't put any attention to detail and care
Yeah.
into them, because just this scene shows that like he thinks about a lot of this stuff.
So the last thing I'll point out, I talked about the creating the backstory for literally the most infamous villain in the history of cinema, Vader. I don't even want to try to argue that he is, at least was at that point. So you're making the backstory for him. So it was important to give him a reason to leave, which was to escape slavery. Obviously, he wanted to take his mother with him. Finds out that Qui-Gon, he can only take Anakin with him. He doesn't want to, but his mom encourages him to, because his only chance at a future would be to follow the Jedi, to
Dude, that
escape
scene.
slavery with
Oh,
quotations. Are you going to talk about the scene where he leaves his mother?
no, that scene makes me cry every freaking time.
It's funny. It makes you cry because originally they filmed it and it was a lot more emotional, and he had to dial back the emotion in it a lot to fit the tone of the saga, because he
Oh
said it
wow.
was just too emotional, which is funny because then we get to episode 2. But
Yeah, it
yeah,
like
so I think now we can talk about Anakin, and you can give me your thoughts on it, because him leaving his mother right here in this emotional scene you're talking about is critical to his development later on. You know what I mean?
yeah, dude, it's like it's a tragic thing too. He's like, "Will I
Exactly.
ever see you again?" And then she's like, "What does your heart tell you?" And then he's like, he isn't really sure what to say. He's like, "I mean, I guess so, because I feel like," and he does see her again,
Yes.
but it sucks, and that's
Not like how he
a really
would have
sad
hoped.
thing. That's a really sad. Okay, so where do you want me to start with that? Like, did you want me to talk about my praise for the aspects I praise, or the aspects I don't like?
You could start with whichever ones you want, but I think this specifically in the second act right here, after we get through the pod racing, he pretty much just becomes a secondary character from this point on.
Yeah.
We only have maybe one significant conversation after this. Because it's funny, after this he becomes a little bit more bumbling, but right here he was killing it with the pod racing, and then we had that where they tore him away from his mother and all of that. So give
Okay,
me your
well,
thoughts on Anakin.
so excuse me. Okay, I don't really like the way Anakin's written in this trilogy. I feel like, because in like it's like him. I mean, it's partially because Jake Lloyd unfortunately quit acting because of fan backlash from a percentage of the population who don't deserve nice things at all.
I mean, he did a good job, but
Yeah, so like the portrayal's kind of inconsistent because he doesn't feel like the same character between Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones. So I think Anakin in this movie should have been a teenager,
I agree.
because he's
Yeah.
basically an older teenager to like young adult in Attack of the Clones. And like imagine, because his relationship with Padme in this movie is like kind of, at least to me, like older sister, younger brother type of thing. But then they become romantic, and it's like, imagine if he was a teen in this movie, they would have had like like cute, awkward banter together. Like they would have been these shy people who didn't know how to talk to one another.
So
Um,
I think that's awkward because we know where it's going to go. I think if
yeah, that
anything,
was It's just
Yeah.
I don't know why George chose to have him start out being this young and then have the next movie be him way older.
So
That's weird.
that's the only thing I want to add to it, is because the other significant conversation I'm talking about is whenever he's actually at the in the Jedi Council, and they're talking about whether they're going to take him in or not. We'll get there, but they wanted to keep him around this age where he's just out of range, because if he's too old, then it's a definite no.
Oh yeah, true.
So he's just out of range. I think if anything, they should
I
have had him
mean,
younger. But
he could have just not had that rule to begin with, and that would have solved everything. But I get why it's there.
yeah, I agree
All
with
right,
you. The writing could
so
have been better there.
but in spite of my problems with also I feel like he's too jovial. Like I think he should have like his Luke, was
Yeah,
the one that was really like rambunctious and headstrong. So I imagine Anakin being, really shy and reserved, a quiet kid, like he's that type of kid that would like stay in his room, for like the entire day just creating things or reading or whatever. But, so it's like Jake Lloyd in this movie feels more like a young Luke Skywalker than a young Anakin, which is really I get it, but it's also kind of weird.
Okay, so I got to jump in here
Okay.
because George says that exact same thing. And I have a quote here from him. Speaking of comparing young Luke, and young Anakin, just like you're doing, he says the two trilogies, he puts the characters, paraphrasing, the two trilogies, he puts the characters in the same situations, even using the same dialogue between young Anakin and young Luke, so that they go through the same experiences, even taking the same paths, so that when they get to critical turning points, they take different paths. And
That's
it
interesting.
subverts your expectations. George describes it as a musical idea. You play a musical refrain and you play it over and over and over again. But each time you might play it with different instruments or sounds. It's the same note, but every time you hear it, it sounds different. He describes it as visual jazz. You take it, you riff with it, that same idea, and you just take that concept and you interpret it differently. So he wanted it to be a mirror, except when you get to those critical turning points, they take the different paths. So the start, like you said, he feels like a young Luke in this, which he's supposed to. And I think a lot of people have problems with that. I mean, I have a problem with it, but
I mean,
I'm
that's
just
an
saying,
interesting choice now
how
that I think about it that way. Like, like they walk the same path, but then it's like a split. Like one of them goes this way, the other one goes this way.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so but with that being said, I'm gonna give my spicy take. It'd probably be spicy to a lot of the fandom because they
Let's
made
go.
the
Hot takes.
freaking poor kid quit acting, which was not cool. I think Jake Lloyd kind of kills it in this movie, actually. Like, he has, a lot of swagger, a lot of charisma. He's a great physical actor. Like, I love that moment where everyone finds out that Padme is really the queen, and then he has this look like, what? Like, he just plays things like that perfectly. He's a
He
good
does kill it.
dramatic actor. Like, when he needs to be dramatic, he's really damn good. And I've noticed this when I rewatched this like a few years ago. He has these moments where like when he's like mad or upset, he has this little glare in his eyes. Like specifically when Jar Jar he tries to lick like a roasted animal at one of the like at one of the street vendors, and he somehow, like, I think it hits Sebulba or something, and then Sebulba tries to beat him up, and then Anakin walks up to them and he says something to Sebulba that I assume is basically like leave him alone or something, and then like they're having this like like really brief standoff, but like for a second Anakin has this look in his eyes, and I saw this years ago, and I'm like, that's Darth Vader. That's Darth Vader. Like, I could imagine this kid growing up to be that guy in the original trilogy that's like, oh, I told you to do this task and you fail. I'm going to kill you. Screw you. You're done. Bye. Like, he has this, like, swagger which is why I was saying to you before we started recording that I wish we lived in the alternate universe where Jake Lloyd would have played Anakin throughout the whole trilogy, because I feel like, he would have grown into that badass that, like, in this movie, like, people push him around and he kind of resists a little bit, and then in Attack of the Clones he does a little, but like by the end he doesn't take shit from anybody, and we see shades of that in this movie, and that's, I mean, obviously due to the directing to some extent, but also due to Jake Lloyd's performance. So I've never had a problem with Jake Lloyd in this movie.
I respect it. I don't think it's the acting I have an issue with. I think it's more so the directing for him, because, like you said, I think we're all expecting Anakin, but in reality, he's a younger Luke, which is he kills it as. So I actually like what you say there. I think it's accurate when you're taking into account the nature of him at this point,
Yeah.
being the optimist and whatnot. So we get a cool interaction after this because they're heading to the ship and out comes a Sith Lord. This is Darth Maul. This is the first exchange in the series between a Jedi and a Sith. George said he kept it abstract. He wanted it to be a teaser for the ending. So it was short. He said he wanted it to be flashy. He wanted it to be lightsabers twirling and dust kicking up and robes flying. It was real quick. So what'd you think about it?
Well, before this, I loved how they revealed Darth Maul. Like, Newt Gunray and the Trade Federation dudes are talking to Palpatine on the hologram.
Oh, and he just shows
thing,
up. Yeah,
and then he's like something like we can't track the ship, and then he's like, it's no problem for a Sith, and then like out steps Maul. Like, he just appears and he's just just badass, and he doesn't say a lot in this movie, which I think is cool. Like, he's the strong silent type. I've heard some people say that it would have been cool if he was like Obi-Wan's like adversary for the entire trilogy, and I think that would have been really cool. Like Obi-Wan being driven by revenge for him murdering his master. But I like this fight. Like, it's brief, but I think it's pretty well choreographed. Even so, I like the he's riding. He finds out where the ship is, and then he's riding his speeder to where they are. And Qui-Gon tells Anakin to drop to the floor, and I'm just like, man, if Anakin wouldn't be so strong with the Force, he might have not dropped
that's
right
true.
at that second,
Yeah.
and he would have been toast. That's like a small thing that is fun to look back on.
Yeah, that's a nice visual. Yeah.
And then freaking Qui-Gon must have been wearing his Air Jordans, because he jumps up to the ship as it's flying, and then Maul. It's weird that Maul didn't like really try to follow him after that, but he was probably. When I watched that scene, to me, it seems like he's like trying to see how much of a threat Qui-Gon is, and then he's like, "Oh, this guy's a worthy opponent. Okay, cool. This is gonna be fun." Like, it's one of those moments of like, it feels almost playful a little bit.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I think I have it somewhere in here that Palpatine, or the Emperor, is the puppet master. Obviously, we know that, but I think he was using Maul as a piece on the board to get Qui-Gon into a checkmate, because he didn't want Qui-Gon training, or really Qui-Gon or Obi-Wan training Anakin. He wanted to have influence over Anakin, which he does. But yeah, like you're saying, he played with him. I think it was just that was a checkmate move. You know what I mean? That wasn't the end of the game. But that's a short interaction between the Jedi and the Sith. It's just meant to be a teaser. It was cool. It was cool seeing that he only had one side of his blade lit up when he was fighting. He didn't even, show the full thing. Thought that was really cool.
I actually didn't even really notice that, to be honest.
Yeah, because it was a big reveal in the movie. Like, you know, that shot where he pulls it down one side and then the other side. I mean, that
Yeah.
was like mind blowing. People fell in love with Maul over that. Obviously, his looks, but that there was that introduction of the Sith, and then we have really the last significant introduction of the movie, and this is the inevitable uh, duo. I don't even know how you would describe these two of Obi-Wan and Anakin. And why this is significant is because Obi-Wan is skeptical of Anakin when they first meet. They're not friends, essentially. He doesn't really agree with what his master's doing here. So you kind of see that mentality of Yoda and the Jedi Council still in Obi-Wan in this point, but not in Qui-Gon. Qui-Gon wants to take the boy. So we'll talk about that more because we get a little interaction here between Padme and Anakin, where Padme comforts Anakin. This builds their relationship. In this movie, from here on out, sets up Padme as a strong, independent character, like Leia was in the original trilogy, and it shows her going from, and this is what George said, from pacifist to when she starts becoming an activist to save her people. And I think, you know, Padme is a great character. I'll have so much more to say about her in the second and third movie, especially the second movie. But thoughts on Obi-Wan, Anakin, and anything else in that scene?
I mean, Anakin. I think one of the problems with this movie is that um, Anakin and Obi-Wan don't really even interact,
Yeah,
which is weird. Like essentially, like the second movie establishes, you know, the dynamic that they have, and it. I mean, I guess it kind of does make sense because like Obi-Wan has to train him as a wish to his dying master. Like, of course, he
that's the
wasn't going to say
shift.
no, and then like
Yes.
in the second movie, Anakin's essentially being like the bratty son who, like, you know, isn't really respecting Obi-Wan that much and stuff. Like they get along, but there's some friction, and I think you could attribute that to like Obi-Wan's essentially like that father who wasn't planning on, you know, being a dad, but then he's thrust into the situation. He's like, all right, I mean, I'll do my best, whatever. I don't know. And then, you know, like in some cases those people end up not being great parents, but it's not necessarily their fault.
Yes, and to add to that, what do they call each other in Revenge of the Sith? He says, "You are my brother, Anakin. You are my brother."
Yeah.
So you're right. He does kind of have to fill in for that father role, but he isn't that person.
Yeah.
That's why I said that was a checkmate move by the Emperor, because who becomes that father figure in the background to Anakin? The Emperor.
Old Palpy, yeah.
Old Palps. So, speaking of Palps, they head to Coruscant. This is the first time we see Coruscant, and obviously he couldn't do it in the original trilogy because of the limited technology. But this planet was there from the very beginning because it's the capital planet of the Republic, and it's crucial to the entire story of Star Wars until JJ blows it up in Episode 7. And this is where you see the Emperor. It's where you see the Emperor take over, and this is where you see how a democracy turns into a dictatorship. Super critical, you know, aspect of Star Wars as a whole. And I have a quick little take. I don't know. I've never seen anyone say this before, but I think Coruscant looks different in the Phantom Menace than it does in Attack of the Clones or Revenge of the Sith.
Huh.
I don't know why. It's just if you look at the visuals of Coruscant and the Phantom Menace, I just love how it looks. I always
I'm
thought that
gonna
it looks so cool in the first movie.
I'm gonna pay attention to that and let you
Yes,
know what I think when I watch Attack of the Clones, because I've actually
I've
never really thought of that.
it looks obviously lower like quality, but I kind of like that. It's also the lighting. I don't know. Coruscant evolves into more of this cyberpunk like
Oh yeah.
thing, metropolis type, cyber. Obviously the whole planet is a city, but like I like how the visuals are in the Phantom Menace.
Okay, I have one quick question about Coruscant.
Yes.
How do you feel about the Jedi? This is like I saw a YouTube comment like a long time ago saying something about this. Like, how do you like? Because like their headquarters is in like a big city as opposed to somewhere more remote.
Like Octu.
Yeah, which would fit
Yeah.
like the whole like Buddhist monk thing that they were kind of going for with them better. So, do you think like it was a strange choice for them to be in a city, or
Here's my take. I love talking about Star Wars, man. I love it. I love it. I absolutely love it because it shows how far off the Jedi Order is from how the Jedi are supposed to be. The Jedi are supposed to be like how Luke was in The Last Jedi. Hot take on Octu, like he was.
I
Seeing
agree.
Yes, seeing the Jedi in that temple in the middle of the city like that, and they were supposed to be keepers of the peace, but they turn into generals, and that whole situation
Isn't
we'll
that
get
how the
into.
Jedi started though? Like I think I remember reading on a wiki like the Jedi,
Uh,
either the Jedi or the Sith, like it started by like a bunch of people like finding a temple or establishing a temple in like kind of the middle of nowhere a little bit.
so we will get into this more because this is a giant tangent, but essentially the Jedi are just supposed to follow the will of the Force, which is what Qui-Gon does. They're not necessarily supposed to keep the peace. So we'll get into that at some
Okay.
point. That's more so Clone Wars and Rebels territory. So in my this is what I think just based off of seeing the films. The Jedi Council, the Jedi Order as it is in these movies, they're wrong. And that's why
Yeah.
Anakin falls, essentially. So what we see of them is not necessarily what is right. Like he can be the Jedi can be the protagonist, but they can also be in the wrong.
Yeah.
I think the Jedi are full of bad decisions and bad choices throughout the entire prequels, which is why Anakin falls. People are like, "Wow, the Jedi were wrong in the prequels." I'm like, "Yes, that's the point. That's the point. That's why Anakin, fell because of you know that whole fallout of that, which we'll get into with our 5-hour episode of you know Revenge of the Sith review. So we'll get into that, but that's kind of what I think. If that answers your question.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair opinion. I can't wait to talk
Cool.
about The Last Jedi, man. Oh my god. I
I
can't
just Star
wait.
Wars in general. I love it. Like we've been going for time right now an hour and a half. I'm obviously gonna edit it down, but like, bro, I love talking about this. So at this point in the story, they're on Coruscant because I obviously got to get back and inform them of what's going um, on Naboo with the invasion because they couldn't send a message. They get there and they have this kid with them who they think is the chosen one. So they take him to the council. So this is what George says. In theory, Anakin should have been brought in as a youngling and trained by Yoda until age 7 or 8, then given to a Jedi as a Padawan. Here we see Qui-Gon go against the council and insist that he skips that earlier development stage being trained by Yoda and become his Padawan immediately because Obi-Wan is ready to become a Jedi Knight at this point. But they leave Anakin in Qui-Gon's care as they head back to Naboo, and they kind of table the discussion about him actually becoming a Padawan or not. So that's why Anakin is stuck with them as they go back to Naboo. So, any thoughts on seeing the Jedi Order for the first time? We see a few familiar faces there.
Uh
Anything significant? Because it's just
even like when they're like taught like when they first bring him to the council, you
yeah.
mean?
Anything stick out to
Yeah,
you? I mean, that's
I all right, so I have a take about the whole prophecy thing, but I feel
yes,
like it it seems written in a way that it's kind of the point. Like it's not a oversight by George. Like it's something he purposely wanted to do, but I hate the idea of like Anakin retroactively being the center of this whole prophecy thing. Like I think like it's such a dumb retcon in my opinion because it's like it overemphasizes a character who wasn't he was important in the original trilogy, but he wasn't like the most important character. You know what I mean? Like he
I
was
see what you
just
mean.
a
Okay.
piece in the puzzle. But then on the other hand, I kind of like I just really love characters that like have to bear the weight of other people's expectations and then like how they how they have to deal with that and how that affects them usually in a negative sense.
I agree.
So I kind of look at it as like maybe the prophecy thing like it makes you wonder where the prophecy even came from and my I'm not sure like if there's any outside thing that establishes this but my head canon until you possibly shatter it is that it's just
If I can, I will.
some crap that they made up that has no uh that isn't supported by anything. It's just a thing that like it's how like some
You're talking about what
you
it
know
was created for this episode.
no like it's like how like certain religious groups like they have like their certain beliefs that they're not necessarily backed up by anything specific. It's just a thing. I don't know how to explain. Like how like the Jedi Council is just like, yeah, a chosen one's gonna come and bring balance. How do we know? We just know. We just have a feeling. Shut up. Are you gonna question us? No, screw you. There's a prophecy. You know what I mean? Like it's not necessarily like it's like maybe the Force didn't even tell them about a prophecy, but it's just a thing that they want to believe in and that they've been like spreading and teaching people about and telling people about. And then they're like, and then like, like
I see
even
what you mean.
Qui-Gon isn't part of the council, but even he thinks that's a thing. So they're like, Mace Windu's like, are you referring to the one that'll bring balance? And then he's like, you think it's this boy? And then Qui-Gon's like, yeah, like, so I just kind of wonder if that's just a thing that they want to believe in and
Yeah.
even like Qui-Gon, is kind of the opposite of a lot of the people on the Jedi Council, but even he
Even he
wasn't
believes it.
immune to projecting things onto a kid who has no idea what's going on, and you know what I mean?
And I think that you might have to dive deep into the EU to find that. I'm not sure, and I don't remember off the top of my head George talking about that specifically. All I know is that it is a finite thing in that, showing that even Qui-Gon believes it, I would just take it as that he is the chosen one. I see what you mean, but I like to believe he's a chosen
Yeah,
one, and I
like
think the
I just
implementation of that, because they don't mention that in the original trilogy, but I think
yeah,
they put it in this because how are you going to explain how Anakin became as prominent as he did, so fast? You know what I mean? Um, because think about how long it took for Yoda or all these other Jedi to even become that prominent, but you need that kind of push to get him to that point. And I like the prophecy idea because obviously the Jedi order is like a religion, so
yeah.
I think that fits
I
the
mean, it's a fascinating
theme.
thing to think about when you look at the end of Return of the Jedi and how
Yeah.
he ends up killing Palpatine. It's like, was that because he was fulfilling his role as the chosen one, or did he do that just because he like was able to tap into his feelings as a dad and he just wanted to protect this kid? Like I don't think it ultimately like it doesn't matter necessarily. Like he still did it. Who cares if it's some like grand spiritual thing or if it was just a human choice? Like
Yeah,
it still happened.
I agree, and I think that's all it is, really. I don't know. If I find more information as we go through these episodes, I'll bring it up. But as of right now, I like it. So they throw him in with Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon, and basically they're like, okay, you guys go back where you came from and figure it out. So they get back to Naboo, and they land, and we meet the Gungans again. And one interesting thing I'll point out is Padme really comes into her own right here because she reveals herself to the Gungan people as the actual queen. And she, well, let's just say the Gungans, they felt abandoned. They felt like the government and Padme would let them be taken over by the separatists. So they had that animosity towards her, and she changes their mind. The Jedi don't do it for her with tricks. She steps up, and I think her character is great in the prequel trilogy.
Yeah.
So Padme reminds them that the sentiment of ecological symbiosis, in short, they need each other to survive. And like George puts it, if one part of the circle is broken, the whole circle suffers right here. So they use this in the final act to set up the Battle of Theed. That's the capital of Naboo. So right here we can get into the last act. I have a lot to say. I'm going to blow your mind and change. I'm going to change your mind and make this the top. I'm going to say top 3 in your top 3. If you take out the sequels, I'll make it in your top 3. How about that?
All right.
I don't even think it's in my top 3, but all right. So we get into we get into the third act. And one thing that George pointed out, the differences between, the Gungans, they use this plasma-based technology. They're very organic people with organic weapons, and he calls it the electric eel tech. It's pretty cool. Contrast that against the droids, who are all mechanical. This creates a very interesting visual for the battle, and it's as he says, quote, a battle between biology and physics. And that's just getting into the mind of George and why he's the greatest. What do you think about that? We'll talk a little bit, just let me know your thoughts on the Gungans fighting the droids and all that, because from here on out, we're talking Duel of the Fates.
All right, well, I like that their tech is like, like, I didn't even really think about like the contrast between, like mechanical versus more like stuff in nature. Okay, so have you seen, it's like part of this like documentary that you could find on YouTube. It was like when George and the producers like saw the final cut of Phantom Menace, and then it's that famous quote by George. He's like, I may have gone too far in a few places.
Yeah.
And then Rick McCallum,
yes,
who's the other producer, he's like, in the span of about 90 seconds, we bounce from, the Padme and them in this battle, and then like slightly comedic with Jar Jar, and then the battle with the Darth Maul where Qui-Gon. So even George and everybody acknowledged the tonal problems in this. And in my opinion, I like the idea of the Gungans and the droids, but this is probably where Jar Jar is at his most insufferable. Like, it's this big battle, and you think, okay, Jar Jar is going to finally, have this moment where he totally gets serious and he proves that he's, kind of capable and helps him win the battle. Nope. Everything he does is by accident. He is useless. He should have died. I don't know how he survived. Everybody has to bear the weight of his stupidity. And it's just like, bro, like, why are you even here? Like, if I was like one of the Gungans, I would have pulled Jar Jar aside and been like, dude, either stop being an idiot and help out, or I'm going to kill you myself. Like, he just ruins the flow of this, because it's like, like this big dramatic thing, but we still got Jar Jar being a bumbling doofus. Like, I don't like it. I just don't like it.
I agree. So he splits the finale, this last act, up into 3 parts, and you're talking, we're talking about the Gungan battle. So you have the capital attack in the Gungans. So the Gungans made a distraction for Padme and her team to retake the capital. This was just to advance the story of Padme, who's the main character, and to resolve the Battle of Naboo. You also have the space battle, and this is where you get some action with Anakin. It's not very significant, and one thing that George points out, yeah, I do too, and basically George just says that Anakin and Jar Jar play the same note. They're both bumbling into the action, but it ends up being what helps turn the tide and gets them their success. and it keeps the comedy going. You know, because you need
No.
that,
I want to say my
I guess.
piece real quick about the Anakin stuff.
Yeah,
I've heard George say that, oh, in A New Hope, Luke blows up the Death Star, and in this, Anakin blows up the ship that controls the droids. Which doesn't, because like I feel like shouldn't the droids operate independently, but they're all controlled by this like big ship that's
they
kind of
are,
like
and he talks about why actually.
okay, why?
So
I want to know
because
what.
of the Nemoidians, that's the race that New Gunray is. They don't want to give up control to the droids,
Okay.
and the reason he said, I believe, was, should have wrote this down. He doesn't want basically them to be them to become sentient almost and take over. That the Nemoidians can't give up control; they have to have the control.
Oh, okay.
So that was the reasoning.
Okay. Well, Qui-Gon, as much praise as I give my boy Qui-Gon, for some reason in the third act he turns into the biggest dumbass because he just has Anakin here and he just brings him into a war zone. He's like, "Oh, you
Yeah,
go sit in this cockpit and just chill." And it's like, bro, like
yeah.
he's like walking with them when there's a shootout, and it's like, dude, he could have gotten shot.
That's
Why didn't
why
he
I
get
say,
shot? Because
like,
he's the chosen one, and the plot
it's
needs him to
yes,
stay alive. Like it's so stupid. Like I
yeah.
don't, I don't get. And then like he accidentally flies to the ship and wins the battle for him, a kid. Like so, how incompetent are these other people that? If it wasn't for this kid accidentally doing this thing because you put him in danger, the battle would have just kept going on and you might not have won. Like it's too contrived.
It is, and it's so funny listening to George talk about it because you can even hear it in his voice that it's like, okay, we did this because we had to. You know what I mean? Um, so that's why I said after pretty much the pod racing thing, you don't really have anything significant from Anakin because this is all, whatever. It's not that significant. Uh, I have it right here. His heroism is an accident. He didn't want to make George didn't want to make him perfect or just be able to accomplish all he did out of pure skill. So it's the foolishness and the comedy of the situation he found himself in, coupled with his force abilities, that led him to the success. And it was just had to be included. So we'll wrap that up because you mentioned a little bit about Qui-Gon not being very smart, bringing him in there. And pretty much he tells him to run when Maul pops back out. One of the greatest reveals of the movie. Drops his cloak, pulls out his saber, and it lights on both sides. And it's a 2v1. I'm going to get into a lot here. So tell me what you think of Duel of the Fates, this whole battle. I know you have thoughts on it. It's a great exchange between these characters. What do you think about the fates of them? What do you think? Let me know.
I think it's awful garbage. No, I'm kidding. Now so the adult in me, the cinephile prefers the battles in the saga that are more grounded and more visceral, and have more emotional stakes going on and like people playing mind games. But I don't care. Ever since I was a kid, and even now, the kid in me loves and even kind of prefers the flashy battles of the prequels, man. Just watching people flip around, do these insane stunts, playing
Embrace it.
freaking I would like when I would play the Revenge of the Sith game with my friend, we would just like spend a lot of the versus battles just blocking because when you block, you're like clashing sabers like they do in the prequels, like they do a lot of that. Like it's a little like less like they're trying to hit each other and more like they're trying to hit the other person's lightsaber. I get like it's over choreographed to an extent, but bro, I don't care. Like it's so fun to watch. I like like you see how much of a badass Darth Maul is because he's kind
Yeah.
of he doesn't
Ray
really seem
Park
to
killed
be
it.
he doesn't really seem to be trying in this fight. Like he's just like fighting them both off. Like he kicks Obi-Wan to the side like 3 times. He just keeps getting dwarfed. You could tell that he's just like, this isn't that big of a deal for me. Whatever. I got this. What? Oh, it's a 2 against 1. You guys are gonna. Oh, I don't care. Screw you. You know, like it's just a really fun and like it's great. It's one of the rare times in the prequels that George explicitly shows instead of telling. You know, like
Yeah,
there's that moment that a lot of people talk about where when Qui-Gon and Maul get separated by the laser
and they
shield.
just stare.
Yeah, and then like
Love it.
Qui-Gon starts
Perfect.
meditating because you know he's like wise and you know he's calm, cool, and collected. Maul's just like pacing back and forth like a freaking shark that just like sees his prey and just wants to go after it and chomp it. And then Obi-Wan's like anxious, like you know, like anxiously waiting for the shield to turn off so he could run through. So like right there, you see all three of their personalities and their temperaments, not a line of dialogue spoken.
Yes, it's beautiful. And is there anything else you want to add? I think that's very accurate what you just said.
I like that shot where Maul like he opens up a door or something by like
Using the
throwing something
throwing
with the
something, yeah.
force at a switch, like very like nonchalant, like he's fighting these two, you know, prime Jedis, and he's just like it's just like a small thing that he does with like no effort. I just like that little touch.
I do too. I love it. So, like I said at the beginning of the episode, George designed these movies to be silent films. They're space operas, and he designed it to where you don't need the exposition, you don't need the dialogue to understand what's going on. And I think you just, you know, explain the perfect example of that. Of course, you're going to need some exposition, but I think you kind of explained the gravity of the situation and how it got conveyed through what we got to see on the screen, not just by them telling us it's important.
Yeah.
And I want to kind of elaborate on why I think this is one of the most. It's definitely top 3. It might even be the second. It's definitely one of the most important turning points in the entire saga of Star Wars. And this is, Duel of the Fates. It's the battle between the light and the dark. So I have a lot here that I got some from George. I got some from, Star Wars content creators, and I even have a little bit of some of my own, analysis I put in here. And I'm going to get into it. Are you ready for this?
Yeah.
This battle was the flashpoint for the Galactic War. For everything we see in specifically the next 2 movies with Order 66, and obviously what that means for the entire saga. This is where it mattered most. Qui-Gon dying was the beginning of the end for Anakin's fall to the dark side. Qui-Gon was the only Jedi we know of that could have trained Anakin aside the ways of the Jedi, where he wouldn't have those same setbacks or dogmatic views that really turned him down the path of the dark side that we see play out in episode 2 and 3. This battle was literally the duel of the fates. Not to see who was the better swordsman between Obi-Wan or Maul, but the duel for the fate of the galaxy. So, what happened during the fight? Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan got separated. This had Obi-Wan watch helplessly as Qui-Gon and Maul fought. We know what happens. Maul stabs Qui-Gon. Qui-Gon dies. That was more significant than whether or not Maul lived or died or Obi-Wan lived or died. From the beginning of the movie, Qui-Gon was set up to be the master of Anakin. Anakin was going to be his Padawan. Like I said, The Emperor strategically put Maul in place to put Qui-Gon in that checkmate. Maul knew his mission. He took out Qui-Gon. That led Obi-Wan to becoming his master, which wasn't the master that was going to keep him from turning, because he saw him as a brother, and Palpatine was there in his ear. So, going back to the fight, Duel of the Fates fight. Obi-Wan falls over the edge, right? And Maul is standing on top of him. And from what George described, is he wanted to copy the Luke and Vader fight from Empire, where Luke was below Vader. But the twist here, says George, is the Sith, instead of the Sith cutting off the hand of the Jedi, it's the Jedi who cuts the Sith in half. Thought that was a cool visual there, how he took that and turned it and twisted it. So now Obi-Wan has to take over the training of Anakin, which, like I said, is the beginning of the end. So this was literally the, why do you think they call it Duel of the Fates? This fight right here holds so much, importance in the realm of the Star Wars universe. And something I thought of is it's called Duel of the Fates, like a duel, like a sword, sword fight, a duel. But it's also, you want to talk about double meanings. It's a homonym for duel, as in two.
Yeah.
So you could say that it is literally a dual fate outcome, depending on what happens here. Let's say Qui-Gon lived. He might have been able to train Anakin, and like I said, aside the ways of the Jedi, to where he could have that attachment and he wouldn't have to hide Padme. He wouldn't have those same setbacks. Maybe if Qui-Gon was there, he would have went to save his mother sooner. Would have went to free his mother sooner. You never know in this in situations like this. It's a fun what if, but we know that Qui-Gon didn't have the same views as Yoda or the Jedi Council. And last thing I'll say is, we talked a little bit about midichlorians and then the Force at large. What really is the will of the Force? Qui-Gon was meditating before he went and fought Maul. Maybe the will of the Force was for Qui-Gon to die and for Anakin to turn like he did, because who knows? The Emperor might have taken over without Vader, and they might not have been able to stop the Emperor. Essentially, what we see is actually the will of the Force playing out. So I think Qui-Gon, when he was meditating, knew that he was supposed to die.
I mean, he does.
That's why,
like,
yeah. After he says,
get killed in this really weird way. Like, Maul just kind of shoves his saber away and stabs him. And for as grand as that fight is, that I always thought that was a unceremonious way for Qui-Gon to get stabbed.
I agree, and people dissect that, but I think it's as simple as Qui-Gon was in tune with the Force, and the Force might have told him to strike there because the Force wanted Maul to kill him.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yes.
You could read it as Qui-Gon kind of letting that happen. You know what I mean? Because he maybe knew he had to.
And that's what he does. And later we see that with Ahsoka. She has the same views as Qui-Gon, actually.
I haven't seen Clone Wars yet, but it's always one of those shows that I've had on my backlog, but it's just really long. But I will watch it one day because I really want to.
Yeah, so that's what I have to say about Duel of the Fates. I think it's one of the most important moments in the history of Star Wars, as a franchise, but also within the context of the story of the Chosen One, of Anakin and the Skywalkers. I think, Duel of the Fates it's a great fight. Maul's awesome. Obi-Wan, when he runs out after watching that happen, he's pacing back and forth. He's ready to fight. When he runs out and fights him, that's awesome. The only thing that rivals that is, Return of the Jedi or Revenge of the Sith. You could argue Return of the Jedi, but that's up for debate. That's my analysis of it. What I'll do right now is I'll I'll just explain the end of the movie real quick, and then we can give our overall thoughts. Sound good?
Yeah.
Because after this, we get the ceremony scene, and we kind of understand the rule of two. I think Mace Windu says it. He says there's always two. So the mystery of the
That's
one.
I'm pretty sure that's Yoda, because then Mace asks,
Oh, true. Yeah,
"Who did we kill, the master or the apprentice?"
that's true. So the mystery of the one Sith was dealt with. Was it the master or apprentice? The other one is actually behind the scenes. And they say that as it pans to a shot of Chancellor Palpatine looking at Anakin and telling him that he's looking forward to seeing what his future holds, essentially.
Yeah, we didn't touch on Ian McDermott's performance, so I think now's a great time, dude.
Sure.
In this entire trilogy, he's one of the greatest villains in cinematic history by far. Like, he's
Yes.
just a classic evil. Like, we don't know what his motivations are, and I don't care.
I
Who
think he's a better
cares?
villain than
Nobody
Vader.
gives a damn.
Yeah.
He's evil and he loves it. And like, he has the
So true.
like when he's still behind the scenes and he's like interacting with people, he's so likable. He's so friendly that sometimes, even though I've seen these movies a bunch of times, he still tricks me into thinking that he's not a powerful Sith Lord who's plotting to take over the galaxy. Because I'm like, no, but he's like really nice and really friendly. Like, he can't be evil. Come on. Like, it's
He may
such a
be the
great
best
performance.
actor in all of Star Wars.
I mean, I can't really. Well, I'd say he's up there with Adam Driver and Daisy Ridley. But I mean, yeah, definitely. Like, because
yeah,
the performances in Star Wars aren't exactly like high class. They're not really a tour de force, as you'd say.
yeah.
But I mean, Ian McDermott, like, he just brings so much. Like, when he's like, regular Chancellor Palpatine, he's friendly, but then once he's full revealed, he's just like, you don't want to mess with this guy.
I love Palps. I love Palps so much. Literally, the Senate podcast is he calls himself the Senate. That's literally where I get the name from. Is Palpatine. It's from the meme. So, if you're listening to this in the podcast, this is where I get the name the Senate podcast from. It's because literally he refers to himself as the Senate. Because his character, the development, let alone the acting, it's fantastic. Our review of episode 3 is, I'm not even gonna lie, it's going to be probably 3 hours long.
Yeah, dude. I got a lot to say just about his dynamic with Anakin alone.
Yes. And that's what I'm hinting towards with this very last little bit I have here, is him looking over his shoulder, telling him, whatever he says. I forget exactly what he says. But
we'll be watching your career with great interest.
Great interest.
And it's like, I bet you will.
Yeah. That's it for the Phantom Menace. I'll say just a few short things. Liam Neeson kills it as Qui-Gon. Yeah. I believe, we're going to see more of him in Obi-Wan season 2. I don't care if I'm spoiling that for anybody. Whether or not they do him justice, who knows? I think he's going to basically, give Obi-Wan some of those, lessons that he should have in this movie or before this movie that weren't necessarily what the Jedi Council thought. But I love him as an actor. I think he kills it as Qui-Gon. Ray Park is absolutely amazing. Dude, I'm such a big episode 1 fan. I met Ray Park. Got pictures with him.
Oh, really?
Got him. Yeah, I got him to sign my Darth Maul Funko Pop.
Oh, dude, that's crazy.
It was awesome. Besides that, I think really the standouts in this movie, for me personally, were Qui-Gon, Padme. In terms of performances, it was Qui-Gon, Padme. I would say probably Obi-Wan, just because Ray Park or Maul wasn't in it enough. But absolutely love the movie. I understand why it could be boring for a lot of people. It kind of is. because it's setting up. The whole movie is setting up. It's not delivering on really anything. That's why they made Padme and everything going on with Naboo the story, because that was something they could start and wrap up in this movie. They weren't able to really wrap up anything like that in this movie. That's why I think the third movies, Return of the Jedi and Revenge of the Sith, are my favorites because it wraps up a lot. But as a intro movie where it's introducing so many people, so many relationships and dynamics, I think it does a great job. Of course, it could do a lot better. I think it could do the action a little better and the dialogue a little better. But in terms of a first movie, I think I just have so much nostalgia and love for what George Lucas does that this movie is so high up there for me. I just absolutely love it. So that's kind of my analysis of it, bringing in a lot of what George says in his commentaries, and a lot of my head canon, and some things you even added that I never thought of before. So I hope that I kind of explained it well to you and kind of bounced some things off of you.
Yeah.
If there's anything you want to add, let me have it. Tell me what you think of the performances. Where does this kind of rank for you in terms of Star Wars?
All right. First, I'll just give my overall impression of the movie. I think this movie's okay. Like, I don't really have any strong feelings about it one way or the other that much. Like, it's a cheesy, sci-fi B movie that has a big budget, and
I
that's
agree.
what George wanted to make.
I love it. Yeah,
that's what he loved when he was a kid. Probably
yes.
part of what got him into filmmaking in the first place. Yeah, I like the effects were groundbreaking at the time. Except for the Yoda puppet, that thing kind of sucks in my opinion. And I'm glad
I loved it. What?
It looks way better in the original trilogy, in my opinion. But
I think so. I think you're right.
Yeah, it does a great. Roger Ebert, in his review, he called it an astonishing achievement in imaginative filmmaking. And I mean,
I agree. Yeah.
even though it's not a movie I necessarily love, it's not going to be a Star Wars movie that I rewatch that much on my own. But I mean, it is a groundbreaking achievement in many ways, for sure. Iconography, all that. As far as performances and character, in my opinion, the standouts are Jake Lloyd as Anakin. In spite of my problems with the writing of that character, that's not on Jake.
That's fair. He did a good job. He really did.
I like Padme. I think Natalie Portman managed to break through the lifeless tone of the performances in this movie.
Especially with the story she was given with her being a queen fighting against blockades and taxation. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
She was able to make that enjoyable.
Yeah. Liam Neeson is Qui-Gon. Great. In my opinion, Ewan McGregor doesn't really stand out until the other movies, episode 2 and 3. In this movie, they didn't. I think my biggest problem is that Obi-Wan doesn't really have that much to do.
I like his physicality.
Yeah. Oh yeah,
that's just kind of what I'm thinking. Yeah.
When he's on screen, he's great. I just wish he was in it more because he gets so good later on. Because he has more to do. Ray Park was great. We've already said our piece about Ian McDiarmid. Fantastic.
Beast.
I'd say in my Star Wars movies, this is definitely not in my top 5.
Yeah,
but I mean, there are there are things in this movie that are some of my favorite stuff in the entire series. So I can say that much. And actually,
at least there's something to love.
Yeah, and doing this episode with you helped me appreciate it a little bit in ways that I never did, that I never really thought of. So I always like when people can kind of change my mind on something or make me see something in a different way. And I think it sets a pretty solid foundation. There's a reason that it ends in a similar way to A New Hope, because like you were saying, like Luke and Anakin start traveling on the same kind of path, but then, as we'll see in the other movies, they turn and they go on different paths, and I think that gets explored better in the other movies. And I can't wait to talk about Attack of the Clones, because that's certainly
Yes.
one of the movies that I've seen.
That is certainly a movie.
It is a major production.
And speaking of just a parallel between Luke and Anakin, that scene with Qui-Gon where they're talking about midichlorians, originally that was supposed to be in like a garage, but he wanted it to be on a balcony so they could have Anakin looking up at the stars, wondering, what's out there.
Oh yeah,
Similar to how the start of New Hope with
I love
Luke
that
looking up.
line where he's like asking how many planets there are, and then he's like, "I'm gonna be the first one to see them all."
Yeah, there's, like I said, there's so much. There's still so much in this movie to love. Like George definitely put the time, love, and care into this movie, and there's so much special about it. So I'm glad we could discuss it, like, and analyze it. This is Star Wars is very nostalgia driven for a lot of people, and this is definitely one of the most nostalgic movies for me out of all of the Star Wars movies. So thank you for coming on and talking about it, giving your inputs, because it's fun having you on. We have different opinions about a lot of topics, especially Star Wars.
Yeah, it's
So
always
it's
a
fun
pleasure.
to look at the other side.
It's always a pleasure. I love having this as a way to drop my spicy takes on stuff.
Yeah, did you just drop the spicy takes? I mean, this is how it's going to start out with the prequels like this, and I can't wait once we get to the OT and sequels, because I've been going back and forth on the sequels for a long time. So I want you to change my mind.
I will try.
All right, we've been going long enough. Again, thanks for coming on. Had a lot of fun. If you got this far listening, thank you. We are on pretty much everything. I actually had Amazon hit me up, and they put us on Audible and Amazon Music.
Oh.
So we're on, like I said, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, Audible, Amazon Music, and I think one other weird one I can't pronounce. So support us on there. So until next time, you got anything else to say?
May the force be with you all.
That's what I was going to say.
Sorry.
All right, see you, man.
Those aren't the droids you're looking for, by the way.
These aren't the droids you're looking for.